Welcome to the fourth in our summer series of UCL Rare-Books Club. I am Tabitha Tuckett and I'm the Rare Books librarian here at UCL Special Collections. And I'd like to thank our moderator today, Sarah Pipkin, our outreach assistant, who is helping with Zoom behind the scenes. This is the fourth in the series, and if you're interested in attending any of our other events that we've got coming up in the summer, I've just put the link in the chat, and that includes next week's session, which will also feature a number of copies by Italian authors, including Dante and Castiglione. So today we're going to look at items from UCL's Dante collection, but not the Divina Commedia. We're going to look at the Vita Nova, and these all come from the collection of around 3,000 plus volumes on Dante that we hold at University College London. The earliest is 1477, and they run through the very comprehensive range from the 15th century and the 16th century, and we're going to see some of those and hear from Catherine Keen about those. But we also have a significant, very interesting collection on the reception of Dante. That includes editions and translations and illustrations, and also a Dante di collection generally, which runs right through up to the modern day, with editions and translations in Welsh, in Catalan, in Danish, and Hungarian, Romanian, Russian, Japanese, and so on. If you'd like to explore those, I've put a link to those in the chat there. We have put a special tag next to all the items that belong to this collection in our library catalogue, which is free and available to the public. And I've put the details there. If you type in Dante collection as though it's all one word, that should pull up all the items in this collection. Now, the core of the collection was put together by Henry Clark Barlow, who was collecting his books in the mid-19th century and bequeathed his collection to UCL in 1876. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that from Nick Haverley in the second part of today's event. But I've put in the chat the link to the archive of Henry Clark Barlow in case anybody's interested in those materials, a lot of his letters and materials about celebrating Dante's centenary in the mid-1800s. Now, UCL has, through this collection, had a long-standing relationship with Italian studies and specifically with Dante, and we have a professorship of Dante studies at UCL. It was formerly Professor John Tooke, who many of you will know, but I'd like to pass on congratulations to Catherine Keen, who's recently been appointed as the new incumbent of that post, the Professor of Dante Studies. I'm going to hand over now to Catherine Keen, who's going to talk about some of the early editions of the Vita Nova before we move on to the 19th century. So over to you.
Thank you, Tabitha. And it's a real pleasure to have a chance to talk about material from the UCL Special Collection of Dante. And particularly today to talk about the Vita Nova, which is a text on which I've been very much engaged in recent research, partly as a result of a really interesting research project that has been conducted very collectively and collaboratively between the members of the UK's Dante scholars, a peripatetic seminar traveling around multiple university sites and welcoming speakers from around the UK and Ireland, showcasing our research and collectively thinking about the Vita Nova in really interesting ways. And the title of that traveling seminar is Rereading Dante's Vita Nova, and I will be sending Tabitha and the library a link to help you to connect to that if you're interested in following up the results of our discussions in their online blog form, although there will shortly be a publication coming out showcasing that material in more detail. So this afternoon I'm presenting some results of research that I'm doing at the moment on the Vita Nova, and I'm just going to pause and set up my PowerPoint to share with you. So the books that I'm talking about this afternoon are the history of the Vita Nova in its first print editions. At the moment in the 1500s, when Dante's Vita Nova, his youthful first completed book, completed in the 1290s, was first put into print. So about 200-300 years later, this trajectory of passage from a previously manuscript-based circulation into print. And it's quite a curious story in that there are two first editions, and that's one of the things that I want to explore today, looking at two of the copies that are held in UCL's special collections, which represent those two first editions. On the left-hand side of my screen, you can see the 1527 volume entitled Sonnets and Canzoni by various Tuscan authors, collected into 10 books, which includes a component. One of those 10 books is the Vita Nova of Dante. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the 1576 Vita Nuova of Dante Alighieri, both of the works produced in Florence, Dante's hometown, at about 50 years distance from each other. So how are these first editions, and how can there be two of them? Well, we have these two versions of the text which provide a first venture into printed form of the Vita Nova, which has a curious form that had a rather tricky history already in manuscript, in that it's a collection of single poems, predominantly sonnets, but also, as the 1527 text indicates, also canzoni, so poems with multiple different stanzas, which are put together by Dante in a form that creates an implied narrative of a love story between himself and a beautiful, unattainable and inspiring woman called Beatrice. And around that sequence of sonnets and canzoni, 31 lyric poems in total, he writes a prose narrative joining the whole together. And so the finished text, it takes the form of a prosimetrum, a combination of lyric and prose. And the two first editions, if you like, represent, in the case of the 1527 text, a presentation purely of the lyric components of the Vita Nova. So only the 31 poems lined up in the sequence that Dante proposes, but without any of the prose linking explanatory material. Whereas the 1576 first print edition includes the prose material as well. But they can be considered to be complementary, to be, if you like, two first editions in multiple ways, because they each represent some of the peculiarities of the rather checkered history of what do you do with a text which has this curious hybrid form, partly lyric, partly prose. So as you can see from my description here, the text which was prepared in 1576 and which seems to represent a finished new first edition of the complete Vita Nova, first of all, actually reprints in the lyric parts exactly the same texts as the ones that had already seen the light in print in 1527. And secondly, it is a version of the complete text with prose, but the prose itself has been subject to excisions and amendments. So we call it the complete prose, but it's not necessarily complete in itself. Oops. So if we look at the opening page of the Vita Nova in the 1527 Junta edition, I hope you can see on the layout of the page that you have a sonnet followed by another sonnet with no prose text, no disruption to the layout of a text which gives us simply lyrics following one another in an anthology form. And you can see at the top of the page that the words Vita Nova stand out quite clearly. So we get the sense that this is a version of the Vita Nova, but the title does say that it is the sonnets and canzoni from the Vita Nova. Whereas in the 1576 Ser Martelli text, I've chosen an opening from the inside of the text so that you can see the prose set out en bloc and the sonnets interspersed. And you can even see that there's a typographic distinction between the lyric material and the prose material, the lyrics being printed in an italic font and the prose in a Roman font. So you can very clearly follow that alternation. So the two forms are often referred to as the prosimetrum form, the one in 1576, which combines prose and lyric components together, and a canzoniere form, like the 1527 one, a canzoniere, a songbook, a purely lyric sequence. In the next few observations, I'm just going to very briefly give an overview of some thoughts about how it is that these two first editions and the peculiarities of their layouts and approaches to Dante's text come into being in the 16th century in this initiative to try to produce a printed version of the Vita Nova. So Ser Martelli's 1576 Vita Nova, if you look at the first page of the text, which begins with prose contents, the title Vita Nuova di Dante Alighieri, and place alongside it a very beautiful manuscript version from the 14th century, so before Gutenberg, before the printing press, you can see that there is apparently quite a similar layout. Blocks of prose, a beautiful decorated initial capital letter for the first word, and the name of the author, Dante Alighieri, picked out in both, and with some annotations down the side of the page to help you follow along the prose block more clearly. And if we look at the inner pages, we see a similar layout between Ser Martelli's printed text and some of the early manuscript versions. I've picked a different text in this case, showing you the openings of the same parts of the text. But again, you can see that there is a distinctive layout in this particular manuscript version between sonnets, which are not centered or indented in as clear a way as the print form, but which clearly stand out. They have some nice red capital letters to help you follow the division in the same way that the alternation from Roman and italic can help in the print edition, and the prose set out alongside them. But there are already some differences between Ser Martelli's and the traditional or the complete version of the text, as I mentioned earlier. So in this prosimetrum, in the same text that we looked at on the previous slide, we can see how in Dante's original text, we have narrative introducing the sonnet, and then just at the point where I've highlighted here, we have an explanation of the sonnet, what Dante refers to as a divisione, a division, explaining how the sonnet itself works. This sonnet divides into two parts, it begins, and provides a little rhetorical analysis of the text. Very famously, in the mid-14th century, the great Dante enthusiast and scholar, as well as independent and famous author Giovanni Boccaccio, produced two important copies of the Vita Nuova, which have a very careful and accurate approach to the text, but where he made a significant editorial intervention, moving the blocks of explanation out of the main text and into a margin space. The opening note begins, "Many will marvel that I have not placed the sonnet divisions in the text as the author of the present little book did, but have moved them into the margins." And he goes on to explain that he considers this to be a more appropriate presentation of material that has a sort of analytical and critical content rather than a narrative one to do with the story of love between the poet and Beatrice. When we come to Ser Martelli's 1576 text, those divisions, which had already been put into the margins by Boccaccio, have simply been dropped out of the text entirely, so that after you finish reading one sonnet, you don't have this sonnet begins like this, is divided into so many parts, and so on. Instead, you just move straight on to the next part. After I'd finished writing this sonnet, I felt the desire to compose more, and an explanation of how the next poem or the next chunk of experience comes into being, suggesting that a response to the sort of marginalization, literal moving into the margin space adopted by Boccaccio, has enabled something to be dropped out and omitted. And we also find that Ser Martelli's text reflects some other constraints and changes in the way that it approaches Dante's complete prose narrative. At the period of intense scrutiny of the values and the status of secular literature in the 16th century in response to the significant church controversies of the period and the beginning of the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Church's counter-Reformation response, the permission to produce printed books became extremely important. So Ser Martelli's 1576 edition had to receive in December 1575 permission to print from the Inquisitor General of the state of Florence. And within the text itself, as produced, again, we have the impression of completeness, but there have been subtle changes to some of the formulae that Dante uses to speak about Beatrice, the woman he loves, as a source of inspiration and a force which leads him towards spiritual self-interrogation and a conversion to a more Christian way of life. The load placed upon an ordinary human Florentine woman has led the Counter-Reformation editorial process to sort of tone down some of the attributes that Dante's original text gives to Beatrice, calling her gloriosa, glorious, or even in glory, assuming that she is, after her death, a heavenly saved soul in paradise. she becomes merely a gracious woman, la graziosa donna, so a more safely human woman. And this kind of intervention runs through many of the prose elements of the Vita Nova. This kind of thought might help us to think, realize why in some ways the lyric material might be an appealing contents to approach lifted out of the prosimetric text, lifted out of the prose frame surrounding it, and viewed purely as a series of lyric punctuation points. So the 1527 version of the Vita Nova, in the giunta anthology form or canzoniere form, avoids all of those problems about where to put the divisions, how to handle controversial material within the prose text, by simply giving us blocks of lyric divided one from another by blank space, but leaving us, the readers, to interpret as we so wish. And in this way, Dante's lyrical traits become more prominent. The Vita Nova's text comes closer to a much admired 16th century collection of love poetry, that of Petrarch, in the canzoniere with a capital C, or the collection, the anthology par excellence of love poems, which had come to dominate the lyric scene in the 16th century, and before that in the age of manuscript as well. So that Dante is both made perhaps safer by taking the prose components out of the Vita Nova, but he's also made more Petrarch-like, so following a more familiar model. But that's not entirely the case, because even in the earlier 15th and the 14th centuries, so before the age of print, manuscript copyists had already begun playing around with the text of the Vita Nova and had found themselves very easily able to drop the prose and to perform experiments on the lyric sequences that remain. So we can see in this slide the way in which the sort of layout that the Giuntina, the 1527 Vita Nova, offers us, with just sonnets separated by a blank line and a longer canzone text, very similar to that that we see here, with 3 sonnets and a canzone text. You can see the no blank space dividing one stanza from the next in the 1527 edition. That's something that already existed in print. And indeed, the area where my current research is very much focused is in the area of questioning how much can you do to the lyrics of the Vita Nova before they really stop being the Vita Nova at all. So one of the manuscripts that I've been looking at is the Vatican Library collection, which includes only the sonnets of the Vita Nova. So you can see in this final slide how the same sections of the Vita Nova, chapters 22, 23, 24, 26, get truncated and abbreviated if you select only the sonnets. So you omit a long canzone from chapter 23, you suddenly get just sonnets. And I'm looking further at what happens if you leave out not only the longer canzoni, but if you reduce the contents further and further. I am working at the moment on looking at collections which offer only an anthology form called the Rime Scelte, the selected poems, which is just 11 of the total 31. So is it still the Vita Nova if it's only 1/3 of the poems and no prose? So these are some of the very interesting questions that I think can arise from looking at what it means to encounter texts such as the UCL Library Special Collections texts, where you get the problem of two first print editions, both of which have a strong argument in their case for being considered the first print edition, but of which neither actually constitutes a form of the Vita Nova as we study it exactly today, in what is as close as we think it's possible to get to the text that might have left Dante's pen in the 1290s. I'd like to thank Tabitha very much for helping me with the print material end of this research, and I'm going to hand back to her now as we move to talk to hear Nick Haveley's presentation on other Vita Nova copies. I shall stop screen sharing.
Super. Thank you so much, Catherine. It's wonderful to see the impact of the materiality on what the literature has to say there, and it's always in a negative sense inspiring to see the downplaying of Beatrice in that linguistic change. Yeah, that's the kind of thing that you can really get from studying the text in detail. So I'm going to hand over now to Nick Haveley. Nick Haveley is Professor Emeritus of English and Related Literature at the University of York, and he's going to talk about 19th century translations into English of the Vita Nova. Over to you, Nick.
Hi, right. First, thanks very much, Tabitha, and thanks very much, Catherine, as well. There's a number of ways in which I think we can relate our two discussions. But I'd like also particularly to thank Tabitha for providing some of the images from the UCL collection, which I've included in my presentation. And I'm just going to now share the screen to get the PowerPoint. Yep, right. PowerPoint is now live. Right. Okay. Rare new, I should add, English lives, early 19th century translations by these two authors, Charles Lyell and Joseph Garrow. Now, the Vita Nova was something of a late comer to the renewal of interest in Dante in Britain during the 18th and 19th centuries. Unlike the Commedia, it had attracted little attention from British writers before that revival. There is, however, some evidence of British circulation of select lyrics from the Vita Nova earlier than that, indeed quite a bit earlier. We know that in the 17th century, John Milton actually had access to the edition, the 1576 Sermartelli edition that Catherine has been discussing. Later on, a few of the more famous Vita Nova lyrics began to appear in anthologies of Italian poetry published in Britain around the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries. But whereas complete translations of at least the Inferno had begun to be published in the later decades of the 18th century, it was not until near the middle of the 19th that a complete English Vita Nova would appear. Now, and Catherine has, of course, also talked about, very interestingly, about that relationship between publishing the poems and publishing the whole thing. And interestingly, we got a similar pattern emerging in the early 19th century. But the process, as I said, was gradual, as this select chronology indicates, going from 1802 with Thomas Mathias's anthologies via Shelley, via the critical work of Gabriele Rossetti to Arthur Hallam, who translated the sonnets, only one of which, though, was actually published shortly after his death in 1834. Now, already in this list, issues about the Vita Nova and its interest for a British reader are, I think, implicit. Thomas Mathias, like some earlier anthologists, is catering for a leisured Italophile audience. Shelley and Hallam emphasize the importance of Dante's love poetry for what they both saw as the resurgent literature of Europe in the Middle Ages. And Hallam made an early contribution to the 19th century debate about whether the Beatrice of the Vita Nova and the Commedia should be seen as allegorical or, quote, real historical figure. Such issues, I think, form a context for the two early British translators of the Vita Nova who were working towards complete versions during the following decade. And here we have another chronology taking the story on a bit longer. From 1835, Lyell's first translation to 1846, Joseph Garrow's complete translation. These two translators in question are a Scottish lawyer and botanist, that's Charles Lyell, and an Anglo-Indian magistrate and musician, Joseph Garrow. The genesis and impact of their translations of Vita Nova are my main subject, so this is the relevant chronology. You'll notice that Lyell's versions of the lyrics, just the lyrics, go into 5 editions over the course of a decade, which reflects the continuity and development of the British cult of the Vita Nova into the 1840s. So also, reflective of that also are Charles Lyell's relationships with major Dante scholars of his period. As his introductions to his various versions show, Lyell kept up with Italian and German scholarship on the text of the Vita Nova. He also corresponded with the doyen of 19th century, early 19th century translators of Dante, Henry Francis Carey, who in the preface to the 1844 edition, quite a late edition of his translation of Dante's Commedia, would acknowledge Lyell as, quote, my respected fellow laborer in the mine of Dante, which is perhaps not a terribly exciting way of describing Dante's scholarship, as burrowing in the earth. Lyell dedicated the 1842 edition of his work to, quote, the unrivaled translator of the Vision of Dante, the Vision of Dante being the title of Carey's translation. And Carey is known to have encouraged Lyell to undertake full versions of both the Vita Nova and the Convivio. Lyell was also, it is known, and very well documented, he was an early supporter of a much more controversial Dante scholar, the Italian exile Gabriele Rossetti. In 1828, Lyell became godfather to Rossetti's son, Dante Gabriel, who himself was to become a more well-known translator of Vita Nova. And Lyell is also named in a number of Gabriele's dedications to his works, and there were some plans for collaborative publication that didn't really come to anything. In 1832, Lyell was encouraging Rossetti to extend his Dante commentary to include the Vita Nova, with a view to Lyell publishing it in the 1835 Canzoniere volume. Yet already in the preface to that 1835 volume, Lyell was cautiously acknowledging that opinion was, quote, somewhat divided as to the foundation and solidity of some of Rossetti's esoteric theories about Beatrice, etc. Now, looking a bit more closely at the books themselves, we can now see how the changes in Lyell's approach as translator reflect developments in what Steve Ellis, in his pioneering study of Dante and English poetry calls the cult of the Vita Nova in the 19th century. Okay, right. This is cover and title page of the what Lyell called the Canzoniere of Dante Alighieri. And as Catherine has pointed out, Canzoniere means songbook. This was reprinted in 1840 it was published by James Murray, as you can see here. It was reprinted by John Murray in 1835, reprinted in a more popular edition by James Bone in 1840. Now, an Italian scholar, thinking of Canzoniere, an Italian scholar currently working in Oxford, Laura Banella, has noted that this is actually the first edition to use the title Canzoniere for a collection of Dante's lyrics. And it seems to follow the term that was formerly used to describe Petrarch's rime. And both of us, both Laura and I, think that Lyell was probably influenced in doing this by Gabriele Rossetti. Lyell's introduction to this edition is followed by an analysis of the Vita Nova, and the translations of the poems themselves are actually given titles invented titles by Lyell, like this one. For the first sonnet is called the Burning Heart, and the original Italian texts appear on the left-hand pages. I haven't shown that, whilst Gabriele Rossetti's influence is actually still reflected in some of the notes to the edition. Right, now we go on to what is in fact the third edition of Lyell's translation of Dante's poems. And this is the UCL copy, as you can see, was owned by Henry Clark Barlow, who interestingly, as Tabitha has noted, has actually made some annotations at points which would be well worth studying. But this is the title page of that, and he calls it, instead of the Canzoniere, the poems of the Vita Nova and Convito. But there is also substantial revision and restructuring in this edition, including a new introduction to the Vita Nova itself and a new essay by Lyell. The translations also have been thoroughly recast in this edition. I've done a bit of work on showing how Lyell does this, and he omits the earlier titles too for the poems. There's no time now to list any of those revisions, but nearly all the versions of the poems make at least one significant change of wording, and many of them have been completely reworked. Another significant feature of Lyell's 1842 edition of the Dante poems was the use of illustrations, which also reflects an important development in the 19th century portrayal of the young Dante, the lover, the Vita Nova lover of Beatrice. And already in 1840, 2 years before this edition, Thomas Carlyle's lecture on the hero as poet would have helped to prepare the ground for a crucial, quote, discovery about the youthful Dante. And this was in July 1840, very shortly after Carlyle's lecture, in which he looked at another portrait of Dante and thought this was a mournful, tragic, heart-affecting face of a soft, ethereal soul. And he thought that what was in fact an 18th century portrait derived from a Giotto portrait. But shortly after Carlyle's lecture, in July 1840, the Bargello portrait of Dante was discovered supposedly the supposed portrait of Dante by Giotto was discovered in the Maddalena chapel of the Bargello Palace. And it was the discovery was undertaken by an international group of Dante investigators, including the artist and collector Seymour Kirkup, who was then the doyen of the Anglo-Florentine community. And much excitement was generated by this discovery, as correspondence from Kirkup and from others has also reflects. And Kirkup's tracing of the young Dante profile would appear in a widely circulated chromolithograph from 1859 onwards. That image contributed significantly to the 19th century urge to historicize and embody and get close to the poet, as is evident, for example, I'm not sure I've got this, I have to go back. No, that seems, sorry, that seems to have disappeared from my collection. Anyway, that also appeared in Rossetti's 1852 painting of Giotto painting Dante. So this aspects of the cult of the young Dante are clearly evident in Lyell's 1842 edition, where this very early reproduction of the Bargello portrait appears. It's an edition which is the most iconographically diverse of Lyell's versions, and it includes an illustration of another rather dubious relic, the poet's supposed death mask. This is the so-called the Torrigiani supposed death mask of Dante, which with the two together, you get a link between Dante, the young lover, with Dante, the aging poet in exile, which became a sort of trope of 19th century visual presentation of Dante. Also, in the preliminary matter to the 1842 volume, the reader, again with the idea of getting closer to Dante, the reader is provided with a map and a sketch of Dante's house, a map of Florence, a sketch of Dante's house, so that if so inclined, the literary tourist can follow in the footsteps of the young poet. And that, of course, was another genre or subgenre of writing about Dante in the 19th century, sulle orme di Dante, in the footsteps of Dante. There were several volumes which were published with that purpose in mind. Now, Lyell's last version, the lyrical poems of Dante Alighieri, including the Vita Nuova and the Convito, in other words, the Convivio, makes only a few quite minor alterations to his translations. His preface mentions Cary's encouragement of his project and indicates continuing concern about Gabriele Rossetti's bold, quote, bold and hazardous theories, whilst also showing awareness of more mainstream scholarship on Dante and his remake, both in Italy and in Germany. This edition seems to be, which is also in the UCL library, seems to be aimed at a somewhat wider readership than the three previous ones, since it actually omits the Italian text. Now, the following year, to come to my final example, 1846, would see a further significant contribution to the early cult of the Vita Nuova in the form of the first complete English translation produced in Florence by Joseph Garrow. And here again, you've got a reproduction of that Bargello portrait in a slightly sort of dozy looking version. Garrow was in his mid-50s by the time he joined the community of expatriates in Florence. He was born in Madras in 1789. His father was a successful merchant and East India Company administrator, and his mother was an Indian Muslim. Following his father's death in 1792, he was sent to England, subsequently took a degree at Cambridge, began legal training at Lincoln's Inn. In 1812, married a well-known singer, Theodosia Abrams, and lived for over 20 years in Torquay, where he served as a magistrate. In 1844, for reasons of his daughter's health, they moved to Florence, where they spent a good deal of time up until Garrow's death in Florence in 1857. Now, evidence about Garrow's contacts in Florence remains somewhat meagre, but he is known to have frequented the famous Vita library and reading room on his arrival in 1842, as many visitors did. His daughter's relationship and eventual marriage to Thomas Trollope of the expatriate Trollope clan would have extended Garrow's range of literary contacts among foreign residents in Florence. And amongst his other personal acquaintances was one of the prominent members of the Anglo-Florentine community, Walter Savage Landor. Landor received a copy of the early life, which is now in the BL, whose preface he annotated, registering some vigorous, even slightly splenetic disagreements with Garrow. Landor also reviewed Garrow's version in the Examiner in October 1846, but he has disappointingly little to say about the translation itself. More closely attentive as a review was that in the Athenaeum of that same year, 1846, referring to the previous Lyell version of the poems as excellent versions, whilst also welcoming Garrow's new attempt at, quote, presenting this extraordinary production in its integrity. Quoting extensively from Garrow's preface and from the translation itself, the Athenaeum Review concluded by recommending Garrow's translation, which it described as, quote, faithful and spirited, even when the fidelity does not create an elegant impression. Interesting. Indeed, unlike some other translations, Garrow's version does not smooth over what he calls the Vita Nova's quaint features, which modern translators have indeed still struggled with. And unlike Lyell, Garrow attempts to reproduce the full rhyme schemes of the original. And here is, sorry, no, I think it's, what has happened to these? Right. No, I think, yeah, here we are. Yes, this, yeah. Right, this is most of the double sonnet 2 in chapter 7 of the Vita Nova. It shows you, I think, how, if you can actually see, read Garrow's translation here, you can see how he does attempt to follow closely the rhyme scheme of the original. On the narrative of the Vita Nova itself, and the question of whether the early story, this vexed question at the time of whether the early story of Dante and Beatrice is a real history of persons and events or esoteric allegory, as propounded by Gabriele Rossetti, Garrow modestly declines to, as he says, enter the lists. But it is clear that his preference is for seeing the narrative in terms of a, quote, modern romance. And that was indeed, as we can see from Landor, his imaginary conversation between Dante and Beatrice of 1829, Carlyle's lecture on the hero as poet, Dante, Gabriel Rossetti, Ruskin et al. this was the modern romance view of Vita Nuova was the prevailing view of the time. There is, just to conclude, some further evidence about the material afterlife of Garrow's translation. It was published by the Florentine firm still in existence of Le Monnier, founded in 1837, which would also publish 3 quite well-selling editions of the Vita Nuova during the middle of the century. And Garrow may indeed have been envisaging more Florentine sales when he designed his parallel text, as he said, quote, for Italians studying English, as well as English studying Italian. If so, he would have been disappointed in that wider circulation, for unlike Lyell's Canzonieri, the early life of Garrow would not be reprinted. Copies are quite rare, but they were owned by some prominent literary figures. For example, not only Landor, but John Forster, the biography of Dickens, and Charles Eliot Norton, the very distinguished American scholar who himself would translate the Vita Nuova. And to close with the cover of the UCL version, owned by Henry Clark Barlow, copies are known to have been in the possession of leading Dantisti in the later 19th century, such as Barlow himself, who acquired this, as you can see, during the Florentine Festa of 1865. It was also owned, copy was also owned by Edward Moore, the distinguished Oxford scholar, and Hermann Oelsner, who was very much involved in the project of disseminating Dante more widely through the Dent Temple Classics series around the turn of the century. So Garrow's early life was a neglected but not entirely forgotten book, and one whose genesis would, like Lyell's more successful versions, reflect some features of the developing interest in the youthful Dante in the 19th century, an interest that would yield a number of less rare English new lives. Okay, thank you, and thanks to Tabitha for setting all this up. Over to Tabitha then.
Thank you very much, Nick. I'm just going to ask you to stop your screen share.
Yeah, right, yes. Okay.
Super. And it's been something I've been wanting to do for a very long time, is to get Catherine and Nick together talking about these collections, 2 of our experts in this country on the Vita Nuova. I'm aware that some people need to leave at 2, so do feel free to do that. But we're going to continue with some discussion until 2:30 at the latest. Your chat is now set so that you can put questions in the chat. If you set it to everyone, we can all see, or you can just leave it at host only and I'll read them out. You can also switch on your video or your audio if you need to ask a question in person, or you can press the raise hand button at the bottom. So while we wait for some questions to come in there in the chat, I just wanted to ask Catherine, do we know much about who the readership was for those 2 printed editions? When there was this parallel manuscript tradition, were people aware that there was a bit more to this work, or were they just looking for something resembling Petrarch? Those who bought the print edition, did they know that what they were getting was quite different?
I think that would be the case, but I think also, in a sense, the manuscript history of the previous centuries shows us that that wasn't necessarily such an important question. I find it very, very curious to see how early in its transmission history the Vita Nuova seems to have sort of been disassembled in this way, sometimes simply by taking out the prose, and sometimes by then sort of reworking the sonnet selections, but keeping this kind of very recognizable, often with a title like the 1527 title that very clearly says this is the Vita Nuova, even though it's not the Vita Nuova. the 1527 edition has a lovely presentation, dedication letter in it, which has a marvelous metaphor of the idea. It's a collection not only of Dante's lyric works, but of the lyric works of several other early Tuscan poets, presenting them as sort of worthy of the curiosity and the attention of 16th century youth. So it is the Vita Nova, this youthful book, might perhaps sort of be what one might make a link, because this is the Vita Nova. There are many other poems by Dante and many other poems by other writers, but book one is the Vita Nova, and so that you might see a connection between the youth who are addressed in the lovers of Tuscan verse who are addressed in the dedication letter. And there's a wonderful comparison made to the idea. You can see a very sort of Renaissance, early modern mindset, comparison made between conducting archaeological excavations and finding sort of damaged but admirable sculpture, to the kind of work that these youths of Florence might be doing in their looking back into previous centuries of Tuscan verse. So there's something quite sort of charmingly erudite in this presentation of the lyric collections. And there's no, I suppose, because it's an anthology of multiple authors, among whom Dante bears the crown, but not only. That's accounted for, but that there is also, of course, there's a mention of the admiration given to Petrarch that has sort of somewhat occluded the reputation of others. So I think there's a sense that this edition is doing something that to us seems incredibly obviously very Petrarchan, but which is somehow being presented with a slight veiling or a re-inflection of that relationship.
That's really interesting, isn't it? And of course, Petrarch and Dante throughout the 16th century, sort of battling it out bibliographically.
Yeah, absolutely.
A question for both of you. Does the originality of form in the Vita Nova have anything to do with the fact that these as soon as this work comes into print, it keeps changing its format and its contents right through even the 19th century translations that you were talking about, Nick? Is that something about the originality of the original work, or is that something that you would expect in the 16th century and in the 19th century to happen? Anyway, I'm thinking of something like Spencer Shepherd's Calendar, which also had the author writing this commentary around the poems. They were both actually by him, but people didn't always recognize that, and they got sort of separated out. That's 1579. It's not at all the same kind of work, but I don't know if that's something you would expect in terms of reception and print reception anyway, or if it says anything about the Vita Nova. I know we've got John Took in the audience as well. I don't know if any of you had anything to say about that.
If I could just add, I think that point about this Spencer is very interesting, because, I mean, clearly we do know that there was awareness of Dante as lover of Beatrice in 16th century English authors, such as Philip Sidney, of course, in the Apology for Poetry. But with Spencer, that it's interesting, that mixed, using that mixed form, whether he had a sense of Dante as a possible precedent here for the the prosimetrum. Though, of course, I mean, the prosimetrum goes back a long way, including to Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy in a certain form. but yes, I think that's when you come to the 19th century, I think part of the appeal of going to the Vita Nova then might have been also because of the kind of confessional Bildungsroman that you get from Werther, Ortiz, and so on. Foscolo's Ultime Lettere di Jacopo Ortiz, and I think that is quite partly in the mind of those who want to read the Vita Nova as romance, as modern romance, or as I think Garrow calls it, little history. This idea of novelizing Dante, as of course had happened with the Francesca story. But yes, as the mixed genre that's a very interesting question. Perhaps I don't know if Catherine has any further thoughts about that.
My sense is that the mixed genre was a problem right from the start. We don't obviously have any autograph copies of the Vita Nova, but the very earliest ones that we do have, 14th century, show really diverse layout. So I only showed a few images of manuscripts, but they do vary a lot in the way that they handle the alternation of verse and prose, and how they sort of signal and when you're changing from this is a prose bit to this is a verse bit, and how you lay out. So sometimes there are 2 columns on the page, 2 columns of text, and that obviously means that the lines of prose approximate those of verse, and it really does often look like just a block. Obviously there are different reading habits that would help you to navigate blocks of text in different ways. I think the thing that stands out in the Giunta, again from the dedication letter, quite strongly, is that the verse is being presented there for the importance of its linguistic interest. So in the whole context of the 16th century debates about what form of Italian is the best Italian, and what form of Italian should a modern Italian writer use, the other important resonance of Petrarch is his the sort of aesthetic dominance that had been established, and that actually in 1525 Bembo, the Venetian, produced the Prose della Volgar Lingua, the sort of the first 16th century treatise on how to write excellent literary Italian, and sort of so that just 2 years later we have this Florentine response in which Petrarch has sort of said, yes, we all know that Petrarch is great and polished, but if we look behind him, we find all these other wonderful authors whose appeal, whose elegance, whose skill, but it's all couched in terms of poetics, elegance, use of language. It's not really connected into the story of Dante, whereas with the 1576, the Sermartelli edition includes not only the text of the Vita Nova with the prose, most of the prose, as well as the lyrics, but it also has that apparatus of the kind that the volumes that Nick was showing provide in the 19th century, of a biography of Dante and other kind of erudite material. So it's much more being showcased as a part of an interesting poet's interesting biography.
Yeah, that's a really helpful perspective. Does anybody in the audience have any questions? Do write them in the chat or just click the raise hand button. Nick, was I right in hearing that Garrow's mother was Indian and Muslim? And I wondered whether Garrow's interest in Dante saw any Islamic influence in Dante's work, because in our earlier Dante series this year we had a day on Dante and Islam.
Yes, unfortunately, there's very little known apart from a name for, because the Indian women who were partners of the English East India Company people tend to be very little written about, or very little documented. We know that her name, she's only presumed to be Muslim because of the name that is recorded, but nothing else. Garrow, I think, is interested. I don't think he specifically refers to it, but I think Hallam before him had done, to this idea that there was a kind of the kind of Arabic feeding into the development of the tradition, the Western European tradition of love poetry. So I think he would have been aware of that. But unfortunately, unlike Lyell, Garrow is very poorly documented. We know of only one other work published by him, which was a collection of religious music, because I said he was a musician, and he married this famous contralto, Theodosia Abrams. We don't have letters. We have letters to him from Landor, just a few at various points. But so it's unfortunately, I just don't know. People have said, this is an interesting, this kind of dimension of his background is interesting. Yes, I'd certainly like to know more, but so far, I haven't been able to discover anything apart from the very basic records of his Cambridge career. I did find, that documentation of him signing in to the library in Florence in 1844. And there's information a bit from his son-in-law, Thomas Trollope, who describes him as a very sort of genial, talented, multi-talented character. But alas, no more than that, contrasting with the huge amount of documentation that there is for Lyell. I mean, still, that's a lot more to be. I think Laura Burnell has been discovering more. But the Islamic side of things is fascinating, but a fascinating possibility. But but he doesn't come at it, so far as I can see, from that angle. I think it's more, he says it's spending a winter in Florence, and perhaps the musical, his musical training attracted him to the lyric.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder whether there's anything about Garrow in Barlow's archives at UCL that
would be worth seeing if there was. I mean, he didn't know him as far as I'm aware. Barlow didn't. But he might well have found out some more about him. And I don't think we could find, Barlow, whereas Barlow annotated the Lyell version of the 1842 version of the Dante poems. I don't think we found anything apart from that inscription on the cover. I don't think we found any comments by Barlow on what he thought Garrow had been doing. No.
Shall we have a little look at that? Because we were having, the three of us, a chat yesterday, which the rest of the audience wouldn't be aware of, about the wording of this inscription on the cover of the copy of Garrow's translation that belonged to Barlow. I don't know, Nick, if you're able to
Shall I
share.
share it? Yes,
Yeah.
okay. I could share the screen and get back to it. Yes. Where
And
are we?
actually, while we do that, we've got a very on-point comment in
Here we
the
are.
chat. I'm just going to read this out. I was intrigued by the letters after Barlow's name. Was he a medic, MD? And if so, there was a strong tradition of Italian interest at UCL in the 1940s, 1960s. So thank you very much indeed for that comment.
Yes.
He was a medic, the MD in his book label, in his book plate, and he bequeathed the collection actually in the 1870s. But we're going to look at more letters after his name, Valerie. So over to you, Nick.
Yeah, I can. This was Catherine's suggestion yesterday, which I followed up. You see, it says Dr. H.C. Barlow, and I think it's LGS. And then it mentions, as we know, that he was a Cavaliere dell'Ordine dei Santi Maurizio e Lazzaro, which was the official sort of order of distinction in the Italian kingdom, which was awarded to him and to Seymour Kirkup and to Lord Vernon at the time of the Florentine festival in recognition of their services to Dante's studies. But I was not able until yesterday to find out what that LGS might stand. And Catherine very shrewdly suggested and mentioned that there is a Barlow geology lecture at UCL. And I then found out that he was actually a fellow of the London Geological Society and had been made a fellow in that same year as of 1865. So I think this suggests that he wrote, it looks like his handwriting, is it, Tabitha?
I think so. Usually I've seen his annotations in pencil, actually. So I wouldn't be completely confident.
No.
It's slightly different in ink, but yeah, very, very likely. Am I right that he was one of the British representatives?
He was the official British representative to the 1865 Feast Study Dante at Florence, yeah.
And there's a wonderful anecdote, isn't there, about how he's put there his title as the knight of the yes. Italian regal honours, but that he made himself a sort of homemade badge about being a member of the Order of Saint Dante, that he recounts in his sort of record of his attendance there. He must have been a real polymath, because I know that my colleague Elettra Carbone in the Scandinavian department is working on his travels in Scandinavia as well, and looking at, so he must have been a very very much a live wire.
Yeah, he was also quite an accomplished artist as well, wasn't he?
Yes. I think some of the materials Elettra is looking at are sketches of sort of Scandinavian scenes.
Yes. And he corresponded with, I think the link with the Anglo-Fiorentini was that he corresponded with both with Seymour Kirkup and with a lesser-known figure, Francis Brooke, whom I've done some work on. And there is so there's there are sort of connections with people who were around in Florence in the 1840s. So that's that points us towards, of course, towards an interest in Garrow, though unfortunately it doesn't seem to be reflected, as saying before, in any annotations to the edition of Garrow that Barlow possessed.
That's wonderful. Thanks very much, Nick, for sharing that image there. Catherine, were you saying that there's a geology lecture or geology chair that's named after Barlow at UCL?
I think there's a Barlow lecture in the geology department. Yes.
We'll have to follow that up. That's
Mhm.
great.
Yes.
I'm just going to ask you to stop your screen share, Nick, now.
Oh, yeah, right.
And Valerie, who has put a note in the chat really about the tradition of Italian studies at UCL in the mid-20th century. Valerie, we are being recorded, but I don't know if you'd like to say a little bit more about that. No problem if you don't want to, but if you did, that would be fantastic. Maybe you're not at you're no longer on the call, Valerie. That is interesting, and I think we have also, as well as an Italian tradition at UCL, we have a geology tradition at UCL. In fact, we used even to be to have a rock room, so we have geological specimens.
Oh, you're muted, Tabitha. You're muted.
Yes, thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Sorry, Valerie.
I'm struggling to unmute.
If you wish, you can also put your video on, but it's up to you.
Well, what I had said, you didn't hear me. You may not want my video. I'm in a sundress. It's a gorgeous day outside.
No worries. Are you happy? Are you happy to be here? Yes.
If I'm respectable.
You are.
So I was conscious of the fact that UCL had strong Italian connections. I had an uncle who trained at UCL as a physician and went on to serve the Italian community in London via the Italian embassy, but also held various offices in Italy and became something of an expert and visited regularly, really from before the war. So he was born in 1903. He's no longer around to ask anything about it. But the strength of the connection was something that I picked up from him all those years ago, that it was a tradition that he had been able to step into. And he was appointed to the, I've just found an obituary of him, appointed to the Italian hospital, as well as various London hospitals, and held various honors there. And fed everything back via the college through the Osler Society and so on, keeping alive a connection that would have gone to other generations after him. He died around 1970.
That's lovely to have that personal connection. Thank you very much indeed, Valerie. There is, of course, a very strong relationship between UCL and Italian studies, and I don't know if Catherine or possibly John Took, if you're there, if either of you would like to say something about that history.
I can start off. I mean, there is indeed, Italian is among the subjects that was represented at UCL from the foundation. So there was the first, well, this is UCL's narrative, but I believe it to be true, the first university which taught the modern languages as sort of languages of high culture and study, and they included these founding languages of French, German, and Italian, and then very rapidly the additional languages, Scandinavian, Spanish and Portuguese, and so on, and Dutch joined. So my colleagues in Dutch are having their centenary this year. So there's a very, very long tradition of all of the languages that are gathered currently in the School of Languages. And Italian was certainly very important from the start. Our first professor of Italian was Anthony Panizzi, who became, of course, a prime mover in the British Library, became one of the most important librarians in 19th century England, and a host of other important figures have held teaching posts, and there was indeed a Barlow lecture in Dante, which has been in abeyance due to some confusion about its financial condition in recent years. But it could very well be that Valerie's uncle, if attending UCL presumably in the 1920s, might have heard some of those lectures, which were they were originally supposed to be held more than once a year, and then they sort of the funding obviously dwindled, so that I think in the 20s it was either once a year or once every 3 years. But there is a very exciting series of Dante lectures which have been part of UCL from the start, and several of the most distinguished late 19th century, early 20th century Dantisti spoke of UCL as a sort of leading centre for investment in Dante studies. So Moore, who is associated with Dante studies in Oxford and was the founding father of the Oxford Dante Society, Nick, is that right?
Yes. Yes.
But he writes that his involvement with giving some of the Barlow Dante lectures was a real sort of push for getting him started on some of the very important philological and interpretive work that he did. And there have been numerous other very distinguished contributors to that series, which obviously we're hoping to be able to revive. The pandemic has not helped with that effort to sort of get things going, because it's the sort of event that one would want to relaunch in person. But hopefully it will be brought around before Barlow's own double centenary comes up too far.
I'd rather put you on the spot there, but that was a fantastic overview of the history of Italian studies at UCL. And do chip in, John, as the outgoing Dante professor, if you've got things to add to that. Nick, you mentioned how hard it is to find out much about Garrow's mother, and I just want to use that as a plug for next week's Rare-Books Club, where we have Sara D'Amico from La Sapienza University at Rome, who is studying for a master's in librarianship at the moment, and we have Dr. Steph Carter, who is also trainee archivist at the University of Dundee, and they have both been trying to, oops, we've got a little bit of interference there. They've both been trying to pick out some items from our collection that have been owned by women in the past, illustrated by women in the past, written by women. We're going to have a section on authors in the subsequent weeks. But next week, Sara D'Amico in particular is going to be looking at women in the early Italian collections at University College London, and some of the women that were involved in the later provenance and biographies of those individual copies through the 19th century. So if anybody is interested in that, I would strongly urge you to come along, and the link I put in the chat at the beginning to book places for next week. It's at the same time, I'm just going to put that link in the chat again, at the same time as this, 5 minutes past 1. Well, it's coming up to 2:30. We could continue the discussion all day, but we'd better call it a halt on what's a very hot day here in London. Thank you both so much. That was really fantastic. And as I say, I've been wanting for quite a while to get you both here talking together about our collections. I'm so grateful to you both for working with our copies, which have a fantastic history. And I would encourage anybody else who's interested in doing that or in looking at the Barlow collection to get in touch with UCL Special Collections. Meanwhile, we look forward to welcoming you next week to look at women in the early Italian collections and women owners of our early modern Rare-Books. Thank you very much indeed to Professors Nick Haverley and Catherine Keen for a fantastic discussion and series of presentations today. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Goodbye.
Thank you, Tabitha.